Good evening. Welcome to tonight's Neubauer Collegium's Director Lecture with Lea Ypi. My name is Tara Zara, for those of you who don't know me. And as the Director of the Neubauer Collegium, it's my pleasure to thank you all for coming and to introduce you to our guest. First, I wanted to just say a word or two about the Neubauer Collegium for those of you who don't already know us well. I know most of you do. We're on the corner of 57th and Woodlawn, and we're dedicated to cultivating research that requires a collaborative approach to solve complex humanistic problems. So we support collaborative faculty research projects, we have a visiting fellows program, and an art gallery. And if you enjoy this evening's event, I hope you'll check out our website for announcements of other events coming up soon, especially this month. We have a very full calendar. One of the events or programs that we support is the Roman Family Directors Lecture Series, of which this is a part, made possible through the generous support of University of Chicago trustee Emmanuel Roman. This is a series that brings distinguished speakers to campus to share their insights with faculty, students, and the broader community. This is, of course, the first director's lecture I've planned as a new director, and it was really easy for me to decide who I wanted to invite. I first encountered Lea Ypi's book, Free, on a transatlantic airplane flight. It was the first time since having a child that I've actually been able to read a book on an airplane. And while my 3-year-old binge-watched Peppa Pig for 7 hours, I binged on Lea Ypi's book, and it was fantastic. Free is an extraordinary account of life behind the Iron Curtain in a context that far too few historians have bothered to research or write about. If you read this book, those of you who have read this book, you'll know that you'll never see a Coke can the same way after you read it. It's also, though, the best book I've ever read about life in the post-socialist era. From the arrival of Western feminists and a World Bank official with an alligator on his shirt, to the collapse of the Albanian government in a Ponzi scheme, to the experience of living through a civil war in a country that everyone was trying to leave. What's so special about Lea Ypi's writing is the way that, of course, she brings a very human quality to the stories she tells. She brings a lot of humor to them. But above all, she brings nuance to a time and a subject that is really too often discussed in highly ideological, binary, black and white terms. Ypi is certainly not nostalgic for the Albanian communist regime that imprisoned her family members, but she's attentive to both the hopes and the disappointments that accompanied the collapse of that regime, questioning the meaning of freedom itself. And as historians really are just beginning to write about the 1990s in post-socialist Eastern Europe, I'm certain that this is a book that they will return to again and again, both as a source and in their classrooms. I know I will be returning to it again and again. Lea Ypi is a professor in political theory in the government department at the London School of Economics. Before joining LSE, she was a postdoctoral prize research fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford, and a researcher at the European University Institute, where she obtained her PhD. In addition to Free, she is the author of The Architectonic of Reason, Purpose and Systematic Unity in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2021, the same year that Free came out. So she has been extremely busy. Today we'll have the pleasure of hearing Professor Ypi read from a yet unpublished chapter of her next book, which deals with the themes of dignity and historical injustice, also through the lens of family history. Professor Ypi will speak to us for around 45 minutes, read and speak, I believe, and then we will have time for questions and conversation. And I hope that you'll all join us afterwards also for more conversation and a reception in the lobby. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for having me here. So I'm going to share some pages from my new book, somewhat hesitantly, because I have just started writing the book, and so the pages are freshly written, and the project hasn't really been shared, and it's very much still in the making. The book is intended to be almost like a prequel to Free, although it differs in ways that will become clear in a minute. And it's also a hybrid between family history, efforts to talk about history, efforts to discuss philosophical concepts, and to shed light on the legacy of the past in institutions of the communist and post-communist period. So what I'm going to do is, instead of describing the project, like with Free, I find it a lot easier to just read from the chapters and then talk about the project more generally. I'm going to read from one of the opening chapters of the book, and it will become clear as I go on reading what the subject is. The book title is Indignity, and just like Free is an exploration of freedom and its meaning, in this context, this book is supposed to be an exploration of the meaning of dignity. And it's connected to Free because, for those of you who have read the book, what I do there is to try and talk about different ways in which freedom was understood in communist and post-communist Albania, and different characters each conveys a particular meaning of freedom. And one of my favorite one is my grandmother, who has a particular understanding of freedom as free moral agency. And often when I presented Free, people ask me, what does that exactly mean? What does that conception of freedom mean? And how can you justify it? So this book really is an effort to kind of unpack that conception of freedom and to connect it to human dignity. But I'm going to, as I say, just start reading from the chapter and then explain what the project is. So it goes like this. I'm looking for the authority for information concerning documentation of the former State Security Service, I say, placing myself in front of the first taxi parked on Comune Parisit, one of the newish busy roads lined up with shops and cafes that connect the center of Tirana to the outer ring of the city. I hesitate to call it my road, even though my family lives there, and it has been my official home address for at least 15 years. Already when we moved to Tirana, the question, or rather remark, "You're not from here, right?" came up with nagging regularity every time I started one of those casual conversations with strangers that seemed as harmless in the way they started as they risked turning awkward the longer they lasted. Already then, I resented the unspoken hierarchy between those who acquired the "from here" title by birth and those who, betrayed by their accents like me, would have to justify their presence in the city. When my family moved to Tirana, around the time I left Albania to study in Italy, my father was unemployed. He joined the reserve army of those who hoped to find a job in a larger center, an illusion he shared with many, just as he shared the disillusionment that followed. I have no happy memories of the place. My only neutral associations to it are news items, communist-era films, and more recently, traffic jams. The most extended stay I've had to endure in the city was when my father and my grandmother died unexpectedly in quick succession, and I was forced to return to make funeral arrangements and Turkish coffee for visitors. Locked up in the kitchen during the compulsory 40 days of mourning, I remembered feeling a distinct sense of guilt that I had gone back when it was already too late. Too late, twice. And perhaps to alleviate the guilt, I started blaming the city. Most people who return to Tirana tend to remark how it has changed in the last few years. There are now more concrete buildings, paved roads, cafes, bars, and cycle paths. For me, it's a place of grief, guilt, and counterfactuals. When I visit, I get lost in the small alleyways that run through the city like so many misplaced veins. I'm barely able to orient myself, even in the pretentiously named Paris Commune, the neighborhood that is supposed to be my own. Perhaps a part of me unconsciously wants to be lost, to remind myself that I never fully belonged, and it's now too late to remedy. Or perhaps never knowing my way around is the best hope I have that one day I might learn. I'm looking for the authority for information concerning documentation of the former State Security Service, I repeat, surprising myself that for the second time I have introduced the office in the formal way it has introduced itself in the email inviting me to an appointment. The taxi driver doesn't hear me at first. A gray-haired man in his 70s with a hollowed-out face covered by thick, dark sunglasses. He wears a checked short-sleeved shirt and a red Make America Great Again cap with the US flag printed on the side. There's loud music coming from his yellow Mercedes-Benz, a radio station called Top Gold that plays old classics. As I stand in front of the taxi waiting for his reaction, I recognize the sound of the Platters' Only You, struggling to beat Lady Gaga's Just Dance, emerging from the taxi lined up after his. He's not listening to the music. The station has clearly been chosen to attract a certain kind of customer. Instead, he's smoking, entirely absorbed in a newspaper that covers the entire surface of the steering wheel. I'm looking for the Authority for Information Concerning Documentation of the former State Security Service, I repeat impatiently. I must sound worried, or at least agitated, because the tone of my voice prompts the driver to finally detach his eyes, switch off the radio, toss the butt of the unfinished cigarette outside the car window, and turn towards me with an expression of benign concern. Avash, avash, he says. Take it easy. Take a seat. Who's that you're looking for? Oh, I mutter something, confused by the fact that he has not recognized the official name of my destination. I'm looking for the office, you know, with all the files. You know, the former Sigurimi archives. You're not from here, right? He asks, once the car engines are on and we're making our way through the busy morning traffic. I smile, trying to conceal my irritation. I wonder what that gave that away. Well, you said you're going to the former Sigurimi archives. That's foreigners' talk. There are no formers here. It's all the same people. My kids, they live in Florida. They come once a year. They say it all looks different. Nonsense. I want to insist I said no such thing. But there is no natural pause in the conversation. He's determined to lecture me. I'm old. I used to be an import-export truck driver, traveled the world before everyone else. I was in Krakow, in Poland. Do you know how many times? He stops and gives a long whistle, as if he wanted the sound to cover the distance from Tirana to Krakow and back. The sunglasses are from those days. I like them. They make everything look darker than it is. Trust me, nothing has changed. It's all as it was. This has changed, though, isn't it? I say, pointing at the interminable line of cars stuck in front of a traffic light just before turning onto Four Heroes Street. They can't drive them, he replies instantly, with the evident satisfaction of someone prepared to crush such a superficial objection. Would be better if they didn't have them, wouldn't it? Well, other things have changed too, I say, more to see how he will handle the next challenge. Look at all those new trees planted. Aha! You're just like my daughter, he exclaims. She lives in Florida. She only comes for New Year's Eve and she falls in love with the lights on the trees. Have you seen what's going on here in the winter? There are so many lights you'd think there's a war. All because of the Christmas decorations. If you come at any other time, you'll see it for yourself. It's all the same, nothing's changed, all the same people, even the trees know it. I'm still thinking about the connection between trees, war, and Christmas decorations, because we are at the end of May, after all. But he brakes the car suddenly, and from the open window, curses the other drivers on the road trying to force a U-turn. We've just passed before a Tembe Mosque, curved left in George W. Bush Street, and we're about to reach the Jeanne d'Arc Boulevard, when he decides to change route. I just remembered something, he explains once the maneuver succeeds. You want to go to the new office, right? The one where they recently moved to. I shrug. Not sure, I say, pulling out my phone to double-check the address. I have here Unit 4, Skanderbeg Military Garrison. I'm starting to find reassuring the formality of the email, as well as the fact that each time I look at it, the content hasn't changed. Come for an appointment on Tuesday, bring an ID, ensure the fee has been paid in advance. I particularly appreciate going through the list of family members. My father, my grandmother, my grandfather, the way the list of names is offered to me like some sort of meal deal, in a spirit of commercial detachment that is just what I need at this stage. Nothing to feel emotional about, just the secret lives of a random group of people to whom I was assigned at birth. like specific items of food are assigned a discount. He nods with confidence. Yeah, that's the one. They moved there recently. There was some grant from the Swedish embassy or the Swedish government, or maybe it was Denmark. No, it was Sweden, actually. Yes, Sweden. I saw the ambassador. She's a nice woman, very well dressed. Apparently, she uses an Albanian stylist. I was surprised to hear. Are you going there for work or for fun? To dig into my grandmother's past, I think. To talk to her. To finally bury her. To feel less guilty. To discover how those wartime photos of her, which we had thought were lost forever, appeared on a viral Facebook post. To find the truth. To see if my father was a spy, to write a book, to bury him, to bury her, to see if it's all history, or if it's not history yet. Perhaps I simply must go, without knowing why, to make myself feel better, or feel the same, or worse. For fun, I say. If I leave you here, will you be okay? He asks, once we're parked in front of the soldiers guarding the entrance to the military complex. They point to the sign that indicates standing there is prohibited. Wait, I say, let me check with them. I turn to the soldiers, noticing their guns pointing downwards, and think they must be fake. Is this the entrance to the Authority for Information Concerning Documentation of the Former State Security Service? I shout from the taxi open window. You're not from here, right? One of them laughs, and I worry that if he laughs too much, he will lose control of the gun over his shoulders. What if it's not fake? Not from here, no, I say. I have imagined my visit to the office like the inspection of an abandoned battle scene. A harrowing walk through dark labyrinths smelling of death and mold, sifting through piles of paper scattered on concrete floors, like so many bodies waiting to be buried. Or like a frozen pit, some sort of descent into Dante's ninth circle of hell, where the ultimate sinners, those who betrayed their family, their friends, their country, and ultimately humanity, are punished. For Dante, the ninth circle of hell is cold, silent, and motionless. Cold to symbolize the cruelty of those whose hearts never knew feelings of warmth or empathy. Motionless, because only love is an active feeling. Deception, like evil, has no positive existence, it's pure absence. And silent, to symbolize the limits of speech and the suicide of language when words serve to destroy rather than communicate. But instead of Dante's frozen pit, I find myself in a space that looks like a crossover between an IKEA showroom and a hospital waiting hall. The symmetry with which the straight furniture has been positioned reminds me of the austerity of lines in a Mondrian artwork. The tiles are gray and shiny, and the white walls have been newly repainted. On the facade of the building, 2 words are written in gigantic capital letters: Files Authority. Your documents are all there in JPG format. An employee who has introduced herself as Vera shows me a black Dell laptop that has been ceremonially placed on a working desk in the center of the room. The laptop seems so decrepit, I wonder if it was also a present from the Swedes. I'm told this is where researchers come. Though I can't see any other researchers, only 3 other employees sipping Turkish coffee on their tables, placed around mine in a semicircle. One of them offers to make me an espresso. I decline and seem to upset her. But Vera points out that I am the Marxist author of a book about freedom, which makes her smile and gesture as if this explains everything. If you need the files printed, or if you want to take PDF documents with you, this is a list with the costs. You applied as a researcher, right? I nod, distracted by the question I have been mulling over in my head, unsure whether it's appropriate to ask. If you'd applied as a family member, it would have been free. I keep thinking about my question. Are there no physical files? I finally muster the courage to say it. The employee who offered to make me coffee gives me a bewildered expression, as if she's trying to decide whether to categorize my intervention as a dangerous provocation or let it go. Eventually, she tightens her lips, raises one eyebrow, and directs her index finger to the chair next to the researcher's desk. Be careful when you sit on that chair, she says. It wobbles. Also, the computer is slow. Don't keep pressing buttons or it will die. Just give it some time. The computer desktop is bare, deep blue with no icons on the dock other than the 3 files containing the information I have requested. They are labeled Form File 531, Lea Ypi, my grandmother, Inquisitive Judicial File 1355, Jafer Ypi, my father, Inquisitive Judicial File 1384, Aslan Ypi, my grandfather. I click on the mouse to open the first document and wait for what appears to be an eternity, but since nothing happens, I move on to the second, then the third, and then repeat the action. I start tapping at the keyboard, each time harder than the previous one, like a toddler discovering a piano, surprised to find out that they have some control over it, but disappointed it does not produce the sound they expect. Eventually, I give up pretending everything is going according to plan and look helplessly towards Vera, who is intensely studying the bottom of her coffee cup. I wait a few moments, then start pressing Ctrl-Alt-Delete to restart the program. Avash, avash. Take it easy, she says when she notices, making a sign which I interpret as an order to vacate the chair. Which file do you want first? She asks, once the computer has been restarted and the deep blue of the screen is back. I shrug. Whichever you manage to open, I say. She nods, visibly satisfied. She continues to click competently until a yellow page appears. At the center of it, I recognize my grandmother's name, handwritten in black pencil. I'm slightly distracted by the sound that the wooden chair makes as it starts to wobble, and a few seconds later I notice that it's my body that triggers the motion of the chair. It's shaking, as if it was standing naked in the middle of a frozen pit, and I seem unable to control it. And I also seem unable to concentrate on the meaning of the sentences that appear one after another, as I keep clicking and scrolling up and down, panting as if I was climbing steps to get out of hell. Top left of the page. Interior Ministry, Directorate of State Security and the People's Police, Section of Internal Affairs. Top right, and almost faded, extremely secret. Further down, a more recent annotation. Fully declassified with decision number 15 taken on 30th of May 2022 by the Authority for Information on the Documents of the Former State Security. Several unintelligible words scribbled by hand in gray pencil. Archive number 531 circled in red. 2 lines with generalities, name, surname, Lea Ypi. Further down, pseudonym. That line is empty. And though I can't be entirely certain of its meaning, for a split second my body stops shaking and I can hear myself breathing a sigh of relief. Then, immediately after, I start to feel cold again and my teeth are chattering. Is there any air conditioning on? I ask the employees. It's so cold here. They look at me, as if the question were rhetorical. A statement uttered mainly out of a desire to communicate something, anything that will break the silence and fill the room with words. Vera makes a clicking sound with her tongue. It was on this morning, she replies apologetically, but we turned it off because the director said we need to save energy now that we're at war. I must look perplexed. Well, we're in NATO, she corrects herself. Same thing. I nod in sign of understanding, then return to the page. I notice a drawing in the middle, a doodle, the shape of a perfect parallelepiped filled with small circles, drawn around something that reads like sect, followed by a Roman number that looks like 7. Someone must have been bored at work. Then my attention is caught by a single word that appears in the middle of the page and has been underlined 3 times, Greek. It makes no sense, and I continue to scroll until the same word appears again in the next page, where other generalities are recorded. Citizenship, Greek. Name and surname, again, Lea Ypi, my grandmother. Place of birth, Salonika. Ethnicity, Albanian. Profession, employee of the Education Ministry. Religion, Muslim. Registered, 29 December 1952. Name of referent who performed the registration, Mayor Hayreddin Chinami. Reason for registration, suspected as foreign agent. On page 6 of the file, the strange word, Greek, recurs again. Lea Ypi, born in Salonika, of Greek citizenship. A series of handwritten instructions also appear. Check if someone with this name and Greek citizenship is registered in File Collection 1 and File Collection 2, followed by another handwritten note. There is nothing here, with here underlined in pencil and signed Vice Colonel DB. Citizenship, Greek. Greek citizenship, I repeat to myself. Then scroll back to the first page with a doodle where the word Greek has been written separately under the paralleliped and followed by proposal to categorize as 2B. It's bizarre to think of my grandmother as Greek. She spoke French to me most of the time. And although I knew she was born in Salonika, I hardly thought of Salonika as a place, let alone as a Greek city. She always referred to it as Salonique la Magnifique. But Salonique la Magnifique has always been for me a sight of the mind rather than a location on earth. Not space, but time. A time lost before I could know it. Or a gallery of mental images, the painting of a stern old man with deep blue eyes and a red fez, faded photographs in black and white capturing people I did not know and with whom casual resemblances of people I did know were pointed out. Most of the time, Salonique la Magnifique was a combination of sounds, from French, Albanian, Turkish, Ladino, Italian, and yes, Greek, but only in small part. I keep reading the word Greek, and it's hard to associate it to my grandmother. Instead, my mind wanders at my first exam at university in Rome, and the wobbly chair on which I was sitting then too, staring at the open page of metaphysics book Zeta, struggling with the question. Signorina, can you remember what Aristotle's term for essence in Greek is? The essence of an entity is what makes that entity be what it is. But how does Aristotle define it exactly? An embarrassing silence follows. Come on, Signorina. Everyone knows this. We covered it in class, and you also know it from your last year of high school. It seems inappropriate to point out that in my country, in my last year of high school, there was a war and everything was shut. And that we never studied Aristotle. Back then, to me, Aristotle was just the name of my next-door Greek Orthodox neighbor. If I really had to think of someone famous called Aristotle back then, only the second husband of Jackie Kennedy would occur. I roll my eyes, stare outside the window, and decide to count the tiles on the floor. I think that if I fail, the worst that can happen is that I will lose my scholarship and return to where I came from. Come on, Signorina. The Greek term for essence is toti en einai, what it is to be, which must be corrected, the examiner insists, to what it was to be, since the present tense has crept in later day translations and misled entire generations of Aristotle commentators. Right, I say. It's important, the examiner insists. So was the husband of Jackie Kennedy, I think. Now it turns out that my grandmother's toti en einai is also in her past. It turns out her essence, her what it is, or what it was to be, is Greek. I continue to scroll down the file and up again, but at this point my brain has decided to play a trick on me. I am only able to read the sentences where the term Greek appears. The rest is entirely unintelligible. It might as well have been written in the language of Aristotle. There it is again, at the top of page 7. On the basis of evidence concerning oppositional activity against the people and suspicions of being an agent for foreign intelligence services, in particular Greek ones, we propose to categorize as 2B and to prepare a preliminary investigation on citizen Lea Ypi, born in Salonika, of Albanian ethnicity and Greek citizenship. You always speak Greek when you have a secret. I must have been 5 or 6 the first time I uttered those words in anger. It was New Year's Eve, and my grandmother's cousin, who had grown up with her in Salonika and used to visit us during the winter, had just arrived on the evening train. One of their animated, mysterious conversations in French about Salonique la Magnifique had been suddenly interrupted so they could switch to Greek. I thought of it as a deliberately hostile act, intended to exclude me, or even worse, to sabotage my efforts at comprehension, a cruel method to convert a world accessible only with a huge imaginative effort, like Salonika, into one fully impenetrable. Mais non, she replied. We were trying to remember the lyrics of a lullaby we used to sing when we were little girls, like you. It just feels strange to translate it. And she sang it in Greek. Kanarini mugliko, esi mu pires to mialo. Secret, sweet canary, I lost my mind for you, and again in Turkish. Except that the word for canary, in Turkish was bulbuli. the same as nightingale in Albanian, and the song felt comforting instead of threatening, like the chirping of birds on a balmy summer evening. And I was so enraptured by it that since then she would sing it to me every night before going to sleep. Greek, I think. Greek, not like Aristotle, more like Canarini Mugliko. The chair has stopped wobbling. I am no longer shaking, and I have enough confidence now to concentrate again on the open file on my computer, where another report appears, typeset and signed by some Vice Colonel D.B. The reason and the material we dispose for a preliminary investigation around the possible categorization as 2B, the Vice Colonel writes, are the following. Number one, the fact that even though Lea Ypi has been living here a long time, she continues to carry Greek citizenship, and she's always hoping to be able to return to Greece. Two, the fact that even though she has been privately advised to apply for Albanian citizenship, she has not only rejected the option, but in the presence of the elements she trusts most, she has expressed hatred towards the People's Republic and the party in power. She has also expressed hatred towards the Soviet Union and indeed towards the whole socialist camp, and on the other hand, she has praised life in Greece and the freedom enjoyed by people there, making comparisons between Greece and Albania. Three, based on her contacts with our collaborator, the Tribune, in addition to what has been mentioned above, where she had expressed her hostility to the people's power, she has gone even further, raising suspicions that she must be an agent of the Greek intelligence service. This for the following reasons. I stop reading. The chills on my spine are gone, but I am now starting to feel nauseous. It must be the yellow color of the typeset sheets, or the persistent scrolling on the blue screen, or the fact that I have not had breakfast yet, or the fact that the canaries have disappeared, replaced by metaphysics zeta. In the presence of the most trusted elements, I read again, then turn impatiently to the employees in the office. Who is this Tribune? I ask. And what does 2B mean? Excuse me, Vera calls. There is someone called the Tribune, mentioned here, who has made allegations that my grandmother was a Greek spy. I'm not sure this file is hers. It's not that I seriously think any of the employees will be able to answer my query. It's more that I can't continue reading on my own. The room is just too cold, too silent, and I feel trapped, unable to move. The woman about whom I have been reading, my grandmother, as it happens, is in danger and I must help her. There are grave allegations against her. Suspicions have been raised that will have tragic repercussions. Someone called the Tribune, someone she knows and loves, has been giving information about her, information that they are most certain to use against her. She trusts the Tribune without knowing that the Tribune is also a most trusted element by the state. If only I could persuade the Tribune that my grandmother's words have been misinterpreted, that she and this woman have nothing to do with each other, perhaps the accusations will be dropped. It must be an informant's pseudonym, the employee says. We don't know the real names. If you look carefully in the file, there must be a list. I scroll up until a page appears entitled List of Collaborators with Pseudonyms. It contains only 3 lines, handwritten in fountain pen, with numbers appended to each of them and the line for notes next to each, which has been left empty. I read the pseudonyms out loud. The informant's names sound like objects. Number 1, the Tribune. Number 2, second informant, white chewing gum. Number 3, third informant, wind of March. The employees laugh. They're all like that, they say, the pseudonyms of collaborators. One wonders who came up with them. I don't find it funny. These 3 entities are like vindictive Greek gods. They're about to hit like a natural catastrophe, a hurricane or a flood. There's an emergency. A human being, my grandmother, needs help and she's about to be convicted for high treason. Her life will change dramatically. I tap and tap on the computer screen, scrolling up and down the file, increasingly desperate, as if the disaster were unfolding before my eyes. Someone must intervene. We have to find the Tribune to ask why they are doing this. It must be possible to explain that there's been a mistake, that my grandmother is most certainly not a Greek spy, that her essence must not become that of a 2B. If you file a request for further information as a family member, you can find the real names of the informants. Vera, who has noticed my distress, points out. Then you'll know who was behind the whole thing. Was, I think. Is it all in the past? Her what it was to be? I look at the screen again, and again I am unable to read past the word Greek. Do you want to find out who it was? Vera insists. I can show you how to fill the forms. I can also give you a list with the fees. End of the reading, and now I'm going to say a little bit about the project and try and place this, the reading in the context of what I'm trying to do. So the way surveillance and control of population through border enforcement and socialist principles coexisted, all three of them, in Central Eastern Europe and in the Balkans for most of the 20th century has always seemed to be a kind of tragic paradox. So how can a theory that aspired to the withering away of the state end up entrenching it even further? And how could this slogan of workers of all countries unite result in the harshest set of policies enforcing the separation of workers by national borders? And how can the effort to liberate oneself from the power of bureaucracy result in one of the most ruthless surveillance systems that the world has ever known? And all the standard answers to this question emphasize the absence of a liberal public sphere, the repressive nature of socialist rule in Central and Eastern Europe, the concentration of power by party bureaucrats, or the replacement of economic elites by political elites. And I think there's been a more fundamental question that seems to loom above all of them, which has to do with the particular historical circumstances in which socialist states in Central Eastern Europe emerged and developed, and which has to do with the way in which they embarked on state-building projects that were both committed to, on the one hand, centralizing power, but on the other hand, also globally overcoming the limits of capitalism. So the context in which, the historical context in which these regimes emerged is one where by the end of the First World War, the Habsburg, the Russian, and the Ottoman empires had all ceased to exist and were all replaced by new nation states, and where people and communities that had been living side by side with very porous borders up to that point discovered that they have become minorities, the fate of which is decided by international treaties, and citizens of these new nation states whose power was beginning to be exercised along exclusively ethnic lines. And so the context is one where a variety of multicultural, multi-faith, and often also non-territorial forms of political authority exercise disappeared almost overnight and were replaced by the emergence of new states, which on the one hand contended with great powers and between themselves on the control of resources, and on the other hand had to legitimize their nation-building efforts. So it seems to me this gave Eastern European socialism and sort of Balkan also socialism this kind of particularly paradoxical feature, which is almost like a congenital birth defect. The collapse of empires in East Central Europe meant that these newly emerged independent institutions had to both build the state and build socialism at the same time. And so on the one hand, the socialist movements who went on to achieve power in the region did it because they committed to a particular variety of Marxism, which was Marxism-Leninism, that managed somehow to reconcile the defense of socialism with the principle of national self-determination at the expense of a number of other ways of interpreting Marxism and of interpreting the kind of socialist project. And although this meant in the short term that Eastern European states and Eastern European socialist parties didn't suffer the same fate that their Western European counterparts suffered with the arrival of social democracy, the involvement in the war and so on, in the long term, the paradox came to a head and shaped the way that these states were built. So the consolidation of the state, including the different mechanisms through which it came to exercise authority, the creation of a bureaucracy, the consolidation of a surveillance system and the punishment system, in the end ended up prevailing over the imperative to fight capitalism. And so when socialism was over, not just as a practice, but also as a kind of aspirational discourse, only an exclusive form of nationalism survived, which we still see now there raising its head in the kind of reemergence of these far-right efforts, which and the kind of parties and movements that characterize these countries. So what I try to do in the book is to talk about this historical context and the kind of these historical dilemmas in the context of family history, which is and to write this book in a way that is partly a philosophical text, partly a political history, and partly a family saga, where the effort is to explore the meaning and the philosophical significance of this concept of dignity in connection to both individual efforts to find out what dignity is, but also collective efforts to assert kind of a collective unity. And where the book follows the first 35 years of life of this central character that you've just been hearing about from the state surveillance archives, which is my grandmother, Lea Ypi, who, as I said, also appears in my last book, where she embodies this particular conception of freedom. And with Indignity, the book title is Indignity, I try to continue this analysis of freedom by exploring further this capacity for moral agency that I think forms the core of human dignity, and how it's reflected and it's distorted in clashing individual and political projects, all of which try to build institutions that, on the one hand, renegotiate the legacy of the past, and on the other hand, are forward-looking in the efforts to resolve the conflicts of the present. So she is born in 1918. She's the youngest granddaughter of a pasha, who used to be a Beyler Bey of Rumelia, one of the larger provinces of the Ottoman Empire. She grew up in Salonika, where Ibrahim Pasha, her great-grandfather, had been exiled by Sultan Abdul Hamid. And she was of Albanian origin, but at home everyone spoke French, as all the Ottoman Empire elites did in those days. And although she knew that she was ethnically Albanian, she had actually never visited the state of Albania. And as a matter of fact, in the year in which she was born, Albania wasn't even a state. It was annexed by Serbia in the north. In the south, it was annexed by Greece. France and Italy controlled a few kind of scattered towns in the west, and Bulgaria and Austria-Hungary contended the rest. So she was born in this particular family at this particular historical juncture, and she was sent to study in the Lycée Français of Salonique, where she was the only girl in a community of mostly Sephardic Jewish boys who had taught her to sing Ladino and to roll cigars. And at the age of 20 only, she traveled to Albania, which was then an independent state, or which was at least recognized as an independent state by the League of Nations, in search of an identity which she no longer had where she came from. She was the first woman to work in the Albanian administration, and she also met my grandfather in King Zog's wedding. She belonged to this elite circle where they were progressives but fighting against a kind of older generation of conservative politicians, and she eventually married my grandfather, who had a fascist politician as father, who had been a prime minister of Albania, and his kind of character in Free as well, or at least was looming in my childhood as a character. But her husband, my grandfather, was actually a card-carrying socialist who had been active in the Popular Front and mobilized in the Leon Blum movement in the 1930s. So in 1946, the war was over. She took up, eventually, at some point, Albanian citizenship, and she participated in elections for the Constituent Assembly, which were the first elections that were free elections, first and only until the fall of communism, but also the first elections where women could vote, and where communist candidates ran against non-communist candidates for the last time, because she voted for these non-communist but still progressive candidates. And within a few weeks after those elections, her husband, my grandfather, was arrested, charged for agitation and propaganda, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. And the year after, a file on her was opened by the Security Service branch of the Interior Ministry of the Socialist People's Republic of Albania. And so she was placed under strict surveillance, suspected of being a Greek spy. She was deported before reaching the age of 30, and at 32 she started working in labor camps, and by 40 she had lost her parents, she had lost many of her relatives. A number of those who were in Albania had either committed suicide or ended up in mental asylums, and twice a year she was allowed to visit her husband in prison, and 4 times a year she would be summoned to the security service offices with an offer to become an informant. So in the book, the story of Leman is told by relying on 2 distinct temporal narratives, which are interspersed. There's a first-person narrative in which I talk about the experience of searching for the truth of my grandmother's life by talking about these visits to the Secret Service archive that I was just been recounting and opening the files related to my family. And the perspective here is a kind of intergenerational one, which tries to discuss the questions of historical injustice and how how younger generations deal with this problematic legacy of the past, and where the question of dignity, which the book tries to explore, is closely connected to the question of truth, where there is a kind of widespread belief in societies like Albania that by knowing the truth about how different families were treated by or experienced this oppressive system, and by knowing which individuals collaborated to maintain it, finally the dignity of victims will be restored. And the argument is that only after that has been done, the next generation can begin this process of reconciliation that still troubles Albania. But what the book tries to do on this front and tries to illustrate is that this only works if there is a truth to find in the archives, and if we can trust the mechanisms through which that truth is transmitted. And the account that the book develops and emerges in is much more unsettling, because actually the archives contain very little objective data. By the end of the book, you ask yourself, how can you tell the story of a life, and even whose life it is in the first place, and you discover that in fact there is no truth in the archives, which doesn't come with an interpretation, and that the different interpretations are themselves a product of historical contingency. So that's where, and so the facts by themselves aren't luminous, they're not immediately accessible, you need an interpretation. And to work out that interpretation, the book turns into a third-person narrative, which becomes more like a historical novel, a kind of fictionalized account of her life, and where you begin to imagine what her life might have been like. So you follow her childhood in Salonika, you see how she becomes an adult, how she eventually travels, and the reasons for why she travels to Albania, and how she tries to become her own person, and fights for her own conception of society and politics, and the obstacles in which she ends up, and where it's her life, but it could be any life of any woman born under the same circumstances, coming from the same family, contending with the same kind of dilemmas, and where that life is reconstructed with, on the one hand, the help of family records, so memories and so on, but also with letters, memoirs, newspaper articles, history books, government documents, diaries of the period, and so on. And so the text reads like a historical novel, and the plot and the characters are instrumental to reconstructing the context and to explain why is it that she found herself at the mercy of authorities at the point in which she found herself, and how she ended up betrayed by this state in which she had invested so much. So there's these two narrative lines. From the first point of view, you see her through the eyes of the state, and her story is pieced together through the Secret Service documents, through the court depositions of family members, and through the spies that were writing these documents and reports on her. And where eventually, as the book develops, the narrators try to make sense of a series of mysteries that begin to appear in the files concerning her life. And so that perspective is situated in the present. And the other one, the third-person narrative, is situated in the past and just tells the story of her life as it moves from, as I say, from Ottoman Salonika to communist Tirana. And at the end of the book, the two perspectives end up around the same date and lead to a more general sort of philosophical discussion around the problem of dignity. So very briefly, I'll say something about the findings, and I haven't written this part yet, but I'll just say what I had in mind. I was initially planning to write this book only in the first person, and to write it as a kind of historical novel that tried to contend with this question of nation-state building, empires, communist features of the state, and just write the story of my grandmother as a way of kind of contextualizing these interwar conflicts and ideological clashes and so on. And so the book would center around these questions that I've just mentioned, because the interwar period is a very interesting one. It's kind of it has very interesting resonances with the present. The Ottoman Empire, the post-imperial context, has been not very much explored, certainly not much in literature, but also more generally, it's a kind of relatively obscure period, and where this question of dignity is really important at this level of kind of both state building, but also where you ask about the features of an identity that of a person that doesn't really have an identity and needs to kind of find her identity. So I was going to write about my grandmother's life, exploring these literary techniques, but when I started working on the book proposal, I traveled to Albania and I started visiting all these different archives, and as I say, a lot of mistakes, or what seemed to me mistakes in the files, began to appear. So the weirdest of them all was that my grandmother was reported as a widow when my grandfather was actually in prison, so in that same period. And eventually her file was closed with what seemed to be a death certificate in 1953. Now, my grandmother died not in 1953, so she died in 2016. And when I asked experts about this, I was told that this is very common in these Secret Service archives, that there are a lot of mistakes, that sometimes people just needed to say something just to pretend that they were reporting on someone and just filled it with information and made up stuff just so that they could kind of keep saying that they'd done their duty. But then I said, but what about the death certificate? I mean, my mother's theory was that she might have had a relative who worked for the government, for the party, and had introduced this fake death certificate to save her from surveillance. And so she suggested that this is someone who was close to Enver Hoxha who might have done this. But in the end, I discovered, continuing to do this work, that another Lea Ypi, who had exactly the same name as her, was also born in Salonika, also of Greek citizenship, also from this aristocratic background with Albanian ethnicity, had moved to Albania at exactly the same time as her and was working more or less in the same kind of state administration, bureaucratic service at exactly the same time as she was being surveilled, and that at some point, since the information I was reading sometimes seemed exactly to be on her, and sometimes it was completely wild, I discovered eventually that there was a mistake, and the spy who was reporting on her eventually got confused between these two people. And got in trouble because eventually the file was full of kind of it became unreliable and inaccurate. And further following on than trying to identify, this was the Tribune who I just mentioned, trying to find who he was and so on, I discovered that he was also sentenced to death because of this filing mistake, or also because he was convicted himself of treason and accused and so on. So I had basically gone to the archives to find the truth about my grandmother, and what I found was just another interpretation of this other character. And since this character I discovered doing research on her that she had died alone in 1953, and that was her death certificate that was eventually inserted in the file. She had died alone, and she had left no descendants, and she had no kind of granddaughters, nobody who could record her life and reflect on the meaning and dignity of her life. And I thought that her life also deserved to be recorded somehow. I decided to kind of adopt her and to give her a granddaughter who would imagine what her life might have been like, and to give her the kind of dignity of memory. And since the two characters were similar enough to confuse the spies, I decided that instead of resolving this confusion, I would carry it in the book, and I would write the story of both without the reader ever knowing which of the two I was actually telling the story of. And so I would blur in the book the same blurring of characters that I found in the archives. And so instead of choosing in the end, because it was one of the controversies around my previous book in Albania, was is it fact or is it fiction? I decided that I would actually explicitly thematize this topic of the relationship between fact and fiction, and use it as a way of probing the boundaries between the two, and explicitly sort of thematize this philosophical exploration of dignity, as you know, with reference to both what you know, but also what you imagine, and to try and articulate, as I say, this relationship. And I would try to find a way through the book of tracing how sometimes history is literature, and sometimes literature becomes history, and these two are kind of mutually complementary. And so through this hybrid character, Lehmann, who is in part fictional and in part not, it would be a kind of interesting way to explore these conflicts of the interwar period. And I thought it would be also an interesting way of just, as I say, discussing what is dignity, and how does it relate to this question of truth and interpretation, and how you assess the reliability of interpretations and so on. So that's the project. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating, both the reading and the explanation afterwards. We have a bit of time for questions, and since we don't have that much time, I thought we would open the floor right away. If there aren't questions, I of course have plenty, but I wanted to give the audience the first opportunity. Yes, Sue.
speaking as an ethnographer, I've always wondered at historians thinking that if only I can get the right archives, I can find out the truth. You know, when you're face to face with people, there's less of a temptation for that because you think, well, I've lied or I've misplaced people's names and dates and stuff like that. So I just thought I'd just like to ask you to think about that or talk to us about your exploration of that whole issue of the paper trail and its
Yeah, so for me,
and our beliefs in it is the.
yeah, so for me, this was actually the biggest, in some ways, one of the biggest pushes for the project was that, especially in this context in Albania, post-communist Albania, where there is a lot of debate around historical injustice and this idea that justice has not been done to the victims of communism, that, you know, there are lots of mysteries around their lives and so on, and where it's a very complicated situation because on the one hand, it's a matter of history. On the other hand, you can't move unless you resolve this matter, this historical question. You know, who collaborated? What did they say? How did people get implicated in the system? And so there is a great belief. It's almost like a religious belief that if you go to the archives and if you open the files, and in fact, there is a very polarized political debate around why are the files not being open. There's people who say, well, you mustn't open them because, you know, otherwise it will break the process of reconciliation because there will be no trust in society and so on. There are those who say, no, it's only if you know the truth that you can. So the file, the archive, the paper, as you say, seems to be the kind of container of the truth of an entire society. And the belief and the discussion, the conversation around it is all based on that premise. And that is actually the premise also on which I started the book. I was like, I'm going to go find out, you know, the truth about my grandmother and so on. But it became very clear within the 5 minutes of opening these files, even just if you just look at them, I should have actually brought a PowerPoint to show what a file looks like. You just look at it and then you realize this is very human and very fallible. There's the drawing around it. There's someone who's kind of getting bored, who's recording information in a certain way. So there is no discipline in keeping records because the person who is keeping records isn't thinking I'm doing this for the truth and for eternity. They're just doing a job. It's kind of very, so you immediately encounter this fallibility of the entire process. And you realize that, yes, the file is important. It's an input to an interpretation, but you can't ground the interpretation just on the access to the paperwork. You need to think about it. You have to think about kind of larger context. You need to reconstruct it. You need to try and think about how can I place this information, which one is relevant, which one is not relevant. In the case of my grandmother's file, it became completely chaotic because I'm not even sure that I've actually read her file or whose file I read. And and as I say, the impulse for me was to write exactly that and to write the story in a way to try and demythicize this idea that you go to the files to find the truth, and after society has found the truth, you know, everybody will be able to move forward freely, and to, in fact, use it as a way to discuss this very question of, you know, what we need is not the truth of the file. We need an interpretation which is, yes, based on the files, but requires much more work and much more kind of collective processing, and there is no easy answer on that front.
There's a mic headed your way. Oh, sorry, we had a question right there.
I have a question too.
Okay, great.
So I lived long time in Soviet Union, and do you think that Albania was just copy of Soviet Union, or it has some specific differences with Soviet Union?
Yeah, no, I don't think it was. It wasn't, and in fact, sort of historically, there was a period of Albanian communism in which Albanian government was and the party was aligned with the Soviet Union. But then one of the features of the system was that it was detached from the Soviet system, and in fact tried to develop its own path to socialism, as it were. So I think what's much more relevant for understanding the Albanian context is, as I try to explain in the book, the fall of the Ottoman Empire and this period of state building, the interwar period of state building, where it wasn't communist, it was independent, but still very much shaped by this legacy of the past. And I think that does a lot of work to explain the specificities of the state. But there was a brief moment of alliance with the Soviet Union, which eventually ended when Stalin died and the Soviet Union de-Stalinized and the famous 20th Congress was done. That was the point at which Albania broke relations with the Soviet Union, and the Soviets were accused of being imperialists and so on. So when I grew up, I was we were fighting two imperialisms, the Americans and the Soviets. So.
But it was because Hoxha like have this link to Stalin, or to Chinese also broke at the time with Russia. What was the reason?
Right. So here's where it all goes back to the Ottoman Empire in some ways or other, with the creation of the independent state, because Albania was a sovereign state whose territorial integrity was always undermined by neighbors, the Greeks on the one hand and the Yugoslavia on the other. And although the Albanian Communist Party was founded with the help of Yugoslavs, the Albanian Party broke links with Yugoslavia when there was a risk of annexing Albania and turning it into a Yugoslav republic of the federal Yugoslavia. So while Stalin was alive, the Tito conflict, the Tito-Stalin conflict made it possible for Albania to kind of hang on to Stalin. The minute Stalin died, the Soviets had a rapprochement with Yugoslavs, which meant that Albania's again, kind of independence was undermined, and that was the point at which they then broke links with the Soviets and decided to have an alliance with China because they needed another kind of empire. And it was only when I was growing up in the 80s, which is what I write about in the other book, that Albania was really on its own completely with no kind of imperial patron, as it were, to support it and to kind of defend its independence somehow, help independence.
Thank you, Professor Ypi. My question is in the same time theoretical and practical. Because the premise of your, or the conclusion of your book, Free, seems to be something about the nature of liberty, right? And freedom. So now my question is this: do you think is there a good measure a good index to measure that? Because if I'm quoting you correctly, I remember that you said somewhere that our societies today are not free. Now I'm not sure if I'm quoting you correctly, but anyway. So is there any way to measure that and to refute the claim of the Western world that we are the freest system that has ever existed, etc., etc.? So I hope you see my point.
Yeah, so I think what I try to do in that book to talk about these different conceptions of freedom, and the one that seems to me the most plausible is this moral conception connected to moral agency. Mm-hmm. Now, the way to explain that and to articulate what that requires is basically to talk about democracy and the way in which people can come together to make decisions, to decide collectively how they should live together. And so the question of moral freedom, for me, turns into a question of political democracy. The reason I say we're not free now is that I don't see, and democracy is a very demanding ideal. It's not what we think it is. What we have is not really democracy. We have constellations and configurations of interests that are very powerful, very strong, and where you have a world in which strong states shape the fate of weaker states. You have countries where stronger citizens with more money shape the fate of weaker citizens. And once you take seriously this idea of democracy, it's a global ideal, and it's a much more, it's kind of much more resistant to instrumentalization and to ideological manipulation of the concept of freedom of the kind that we find in the societies in which we live. But since that is the ideal, I think it's worth using that ideal, that kind of moral ideal, to think critically about the societies in which we live. And so it's not really about having a standard, it's about having a vision of how you think institutions might have to be constructed for us to work out what freedom is. And that's a democratic exercise. And you can't have that democratic exercise in motion until you have institutions that enable you to have democracy.
So basically you are saying there's no standard to measure it against.
Well, there is a moral standard. So
yeah, but how?
But that's to kind of exemplify that standard. You need then institutions and you need democratic decision making.
And in that way, you can measure progress toward the freedom.
Yeah,
that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Too. One follows on Sue's question, and it's about archives. I mentioned Cristina Vadulescu's work earlier about the Romanian archives, and one of the things that was really striking in her case was how, also looking at kind of the relationship between literature and archives. is how disruptive the bugging device was so that she said she was, requesting files in the Romanian Secret Service, and, for 1972, she got a pile like this, and then for 1973, they had to roll out 6 carts of material. And I know it sounds like your grandmother's file was closed before probably the advent of bugging, but I was just wondering if you got there with any of your other characters, and if that same kind of fragmenting and explosive effect was evident. And then I had I guess a more theoretical question, I guess, which is, dignity to me is very much a political theorist's kind of concept, and not one that I think historians work with much. But I was thinking about it and wondering if, just as in your first book, you ultimately present us with a multiplicity of conceptions of freedom, whether there are competing understandings of dignity at work in the time period you're writing about, and what those are. You sort of talked about your grandmother's, but if you encounter other visions of what dignity meant at the time to people embedded in different political ideologies or simply in different life perspectives. And then finally, a third question is just, as a historian, I'm really intrigued by thinking about the links between the post-imperial moment of the interwar period and the communist regimes that followed. And here the question is very specific. Did your grandmother talk about a relationship between those periods at all as one of continuity, as opposed to total rupture, which would have been the, I imagine, the official party line about the pre-war history?
Thanks. So the first question about bugging, the files that I saw were all based on people actually following. So it was like, this person went here, she met this person, she was in this hotel from this time to this time, and it didn't involve microchips or anything like that. So because this file was closed in 1953, it's possible that later on it became much more complicated, the whole system. For me, it was more just, physical following, and of course, and a lot of it was also based on, and this is another aspect which I didn't get to talk much about, a lot of it is based on witnesses in trial saying certain things. And this is another myth around it, which is extremely complicated and will be very difficult to talk about in Albania, because we have this idea that the victims of regime were heroes. But actually, if you look at the files of people who were condemned to death, just before they died, they gave all the names they could. I haven't come across a single example of someone who actually withheld information that could have saved their lives. So everyone, at the moment where they were threatened with killing, and some of them were killed afterwards, they all made names of family members or kind of gave information and so on. So it's very rare. I mean, there are heroes of the kind that we celebrate, but it's really very, very difficult. And this is also why the book in the end is called Indignity rather than Dignity, because you find indignity a lot more frequently than you find dignity, and dignity is much more kind of an ideal. I did want to, I had planned of doing a bit like with freedom, kind of going through these different conceptions and but in that case it would be, while freedom was part of a kind of slogan, in the post-90s, this was like the era of freedom and it was mentioned. I guess in this interwar discourse, you find a little bit this discussion, but it's more around some kind of conception of non-domination. So we need to be independent, or some sense in which the empire is collapsed and you need to have your own state, and this conception of what does it mean. The confrontation with Western European, with kind of advanced states, is constantly there in these texts that I've been looking at, of these Albanian intellectuals who were writing about the importance of having an independent state. And look at Britain and look at France, and there's all these models of Western states that successfully built their institutions, and the sense that you're catching up with inferior somehow, with inferior institutions. So the discourse on dignity is there, but I don't know that it's explicit. For me, dignity was the concept that enabled me to make sense of this search in some way for worth, and both at the individual level and at the collective level. And of course, in the interwar period, it comes from different angles. So there is a fascist kind of conservative conception, there is a communist, socialist conception, there is a liberal one that is about institutions, and so on. So that's what I try to do in the book, is to go through the changing meanings and the ideological efforts to appropriate this concept and to justify then a whole view of the world and of society in connection to it. And finally, on the question of post-imperial kind of rupture and communism, I think my grandmother, the interesting thing was she never really articulated that she belonged to the imperial world, right? So the only way, the closest I came to that was the fact that she spoke French, and that there was a kind of carrier, there was a marker of a world in the language that she never made a point of theoretically, or kind of never explicitly made it, but it was there, and she was there, and she came from a certain time. And in part because in communist Albania, it was really difficult to talk about the Ottoman legacy with any nostalgia. You know, this was a historiography built around the resistance to empires, starting with, you know, the Romans way back when, Albanians, even though this was way before Albania existed as a political institution, but, you know, you try to find these continuities in history, and you say the Albanians were fighting the Romans, then we're fighting the Ottomans, and then now we're fighting the fascists and the Nazis, and then eventually the communists came. So there was a kind of progressive narrative of historical forces mobilized to, and it was very difficult for individuals to articulate anything alternative to that, you know, to say actually this world. It's only when you look at the texts outside the communist paradigm, the communist historiography, that you realize how important the empire is and was, and actually how much of a backbone it provided to society before it collapsed. That, you know, not everybody was in Albania thought about becoming independent from the Ottoman Empire, quite the opposite.
I'm curious if there are any issues in your research and your writing of the privacy of any of the characters, given that in ethnography and in journalism, there are sort of ethical practices about fictionalizing characters, events, incidents for the protection of living, as well as maybe even the reputations of late characters. And speaking of fiction, is Franz Kafka of use in your styling?
Yeah, well, always of use when you're talking about the power of these documents and the way they kind of hold these lives captive. I think there in Albania, the process of opening the Secret Service files has been done with, as everything in Albania, copying some other model from somewhere. So copying the Eastern German law with regard to how you access it, and it's very. It tries to tread very carefully with regard to enabling you to have access to information, but also not so much access immediately that you can actually get other people in trouble. So in the files that I found about my grandmother, for example, her name and her names of her relatives are, but when it comes to the other people mentioned in the files, they're all in black marker, so they're canceled. And you need to get into a further process if you want to find out who these people were. As I say, with regard to this one spy that I was interested in, who was the one that ended up having a kind of tragic life himself, I went and started looking to see who he was. But I never really wanted to know the names of who had been surveilling and reporting. And so this is another thing that I felt a lot of my fellow Albanians got wrong in terms of thinking, if you find the name, if you find which family it was, you will have closure. I never thought that, you know, it would give me closure to know that, you know, Tara, whoever spied on my family. I just thought, in a context where everyone is complicit, where there is this kind of pervasive system of oppression, where you realize, as I say, even when you look at the victims, how complicit they were at the end, there's no kind of real moral judgment. Nobody's really pure. And it seems to me it's much more instrumentalized and politicized, and to serve the ends of politicians who are now in office and try to use this to advance their own, you know, party campaigns or whatever, where they say, we will do this, we will do that. So it seems to me that the whole question of memory is really instrumentalized and not in good faith, not done with the real effort to actually come to terms with the past, because it seems to me that effort is much more complicated than we make it to be when we think about individual names and so on. So I think, yeah, so just to go back to the characters, I will fictionalize them all when I end up sort of writing these parts. I'm not going to reveal the names of the spies that I read, and yeah, so
that would be similar, I guess, to how it's done in journalism and with this kind of effort to protect the privacy of third parties. But I know I will also be in trouble for doing that because, like with my other book in Albania, there was a lot of controversy around that and which part of it was fiction, which part of it was true. And in this case, it's even more because it's in the past. So.
Sorry. Last two questions. Thanks.
Okay, I'll be fast. My question is also about continuity. Tara asked about the interwar period to the communist period and if there were any kind of personal continuities in your grandmother's life. Mine is about the communist period to the post-communist period. I read and loved Free, also at Tara's recommendation, and in that I got this profound sense of like bewildering rupture in the post-communist period among your family. So I guess I wonder if there's any part of you that kind of agrees with the taxi driver who is saying nothing has changed, it's all the same, you know, everything that's changed is superficial.
So there is a part of me that thinks that nothing is changed, but in a very specific way, in the sense that I think there is a kind of latent authoritarian tendency in Albanian society, which again, I mean, I'm sorry if I go on about this whole empire stuff, but I think it kind of goes back to this, to the modalities of the fall of the empire and to the modalities of building of the state. And it's the fact that people are, they don't rely on institutions, they are used to relying on individuals. And when this crosses into a political level, it becomes reverence for particular individuals. And it doesn't really matter which individual is in office, but it's this very weird and perverse combination of, on the one hand, utter cynicism about the society in which you live and about the fact that, you know, you're not that invested in it because you think everybody is bad and everybody is kind of not really moral and everyone is just trying to advance their own interests on the one hand, and lip service paid to authority and just kind of subservience to authority. So your boss tells you to do something and you just do it because it's easier to just do it than to. And I think that contributes to creating this sense of kind of, you know, it doesn't really matter then who is in power, but this kind of latent authoritarianism in society, which I think is very pervasive and still very problematic. And I think has to do with the way in which political authority and the relationship to political authority has been negotiated ever since the state kind of became independent. So that's where I see the largest continuity and the most difficult problem to solve in a way. Because it's not really about which particular individual is in power, it's just a relationship to power that goes beyond the particular individuals.
Thank you for the talk, I really appreciated it. I appreciate the genre bending aspect of it, but also the just sheer emotional and psychological burden that it has to be to do this kind of work about people that you knew. But I have a question about the archival portion of the talk, or the discussion of the archives, because it seems to me that, right, we should interpret archives, we shouldn't assume that what we're going to find there is the truth or the fact of the matter. But it does seem at moments in the talk that you do appeal to archives as the fact of the matter. So, you know, there's this other person who seems to have a remarkable similarity to your grandmother's life, and we presumably know this because we know it by way of the paper. And there's an assumption there that the paper is telling the truth in the distinction. And I wonder why we have faith that it's telling the truth in the distinction. Equally, you know, your remark a couple of minutes ago about the fact that we find people at the cusp of their execution naming names, and the presupposition is that the names they're naming are names that are at risk, as opposed to names that are already known. That you know, maybe it is an act of heroism. How do we know it isn't an act of heroism, but for the fact that there's a scratch on a piece of paper that we take to, in this instance, represent fact? And so I just wonder, why not take the interpretive principle all the way down? That, you know, there is no truth here to be found. There are a set of interpretive positions that have been laid out for us, and it's not our job to root through them for the facts. That seems to be your position, but nor then can we have any security that what we ever find there is anything other than, you know, turtles all the way down.
Yeah, I think I'm not prepared to go there yet. As in, I think I want to kind of complicate what you find, but I don't want to completely give up on this idea that it's all constructed and we have no way of telling. So I think if we access the archives with awareness of the possibilities of error and fallibility and so on, we can still get something out of them which is productive and which plays a role in how we think about memory and so on. And I worry that if we say, well, it's all a lie anyway, then, you know, then why go to the archives? Why not go somewhere else? Why don't do something completely different? So the fact that we believe that there are some of these kinds of, I guess, institutions or practices and that we have some faith in them, I think we shouldn't have too much faith, but I also think it goes too far to say we should have no faith, and yeah.
But it's not a matter of it being the truth or a lie, which is to just make it the truth or, or not the truth, right? The truth becomes the anchoring principle. It's that it is, in some respect, perspectival all the way down.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Then why is anyone writing on any piece of paper at any point in the past?
Yeah, but I guess I think that's true, and I agree with that, but I also think that from the sum total of these different perspectives, something that approximates some kind of sense of I'm getting somewhere with it emerges. So that's where I think maybe we differ, and that's where I'm sort of reluctant to go. That's why I'm reluctant to go all the way down. So I'm all for kind of including all these different perspectives, but I think I also believe that there is something larger that emerges from when these different perspectives come together.
Sorry, I think we are unfortunately out of time, but thank you to everybody in the audience for coming and for your questions. And please join us outside for a reception. Thank you.